Hi everyone, my name's Ben. I'm a science fiction and fantasy author, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a writing analysis of the first page of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. We're going to go paragraph by paragraph. I've got a little bit more than the first page here. I think this is like the first page and a half. But I saw this paragraph and I thought it would be a really great one to end on, so it's included. I think we're going to be able to get through it all. We're going to go line by line, word by word, hopefully not letter by letter, but we're going to see what we can learn. So let's get stuck in. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. And what a great chapter title, right? I know it's iconic now, but you have to cast yourself back to 1997 or whenever this came out, and imagine that you don't know, Harry Potter isn't this big thing. I'm reading it for the very first time, The Boy Who Lived. This implies that he might have died, right? So we're beginning the entire series with some life and death drama, which is great. Chapter titles are really fun to write and to use. Do you not find that sometimes you're reading and you're like, okay, this is the last chapter. You get to the end and then you can see on the next page the chapter title, and it's such a good chapter title. Maybe it's teasing something or it's playful, and you're like, okay, I'll read it. Fair enough. Good chapter titles can do that. What was it? You can also have fun with them. The Prisoner of Azkaban begins with Owl Post and then ends with Owl Post again. I always liked that when I was a kid. I thought it was good. I thought it was great. And Tolkien has some good chapter titles as well. There are loads of great chapter titles out there. They're almost like book titles, right? Yeah, they can be a good teaser. You don't have to use chapter titles. It's fine. You can use just numbers, or you don't even need to have chapters at all. I think, was it Colour of Magic? I think doesn't have chapters. It just has little scene breaks. But the entire book, there's no chapters at all. It's fine. Works well. Anyway, we haven't even started yet. Let's get going. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. So the first thing I like to look for when I'm reading a book, the first thing that I want to know is the perspective. I will notice the tense as well, and the tense here is quite obvious. We're in the past. We're not going to move from the past. You can switch between past and present tense. Writers do it, but what you want to watch out for is accidentally doing it, right? You don't want to begin your story in past and then accidentally switch to an is or an are, and then shift between the two. You want to lock yourself in with past tense, and the entire series of Harry Potter is all in past tense. There's no present tense at all. Past tense is way more common. Present tense, I think there's quite a few first person present tense books. Quite a lot of young adult is written like that. But yeah, it's obvious. I know we're in the past. The perspective, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, we'll have to come back to that. We've got Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. We've got our two characters. But whose eyes are we viewing the world through right now? It's not entirely clear. We've got this you'd here, right? They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious. Is she referring to me, the reader? Well, yes, but this isn't second person, right? She's not actually referring to you. It's like this colloquial you. The last people you'd expect is a common phrase. She's not specifically saying the last people you'd expect. So I'd say we're not really breaking any kind of perspective here. That's fine. Some people might not. They might say, "Oh, you should never use the word you if you're strictly in third person." But this is fine. It's not going to tear anyone out of their immersion. If halfway down she starts talking about you directly, you the reader, then that might be a bit weird. But that's fine. But the perspective isn't clear. You would expect that this is going to be told from the perspective of Mr. Dursley, but we'll see. Another thing I like to figure out when I'm reading fantasy especially is a location. I like characters, I like a location. You don't have to have a location when you begin your story. You can begin with just some dialogue, two people having a conversation. You could begin, if you're in first person, you could begin with, some philosophical ideas or something like that. But in fantasy especially, I really like to have a location as soon as possible, because unless you've done your research, unless it's very clear from the book cover and the blurb and that kind of thing, you really have no idea when this is set or where this is set. And what you don't want to end up with is a situation where you have pages and pages of characters having a conversation, and then it turns out in the next chapter that they were on a spaceship the whole time, right? Or that they were in some enchanted castle at the bottom of the ocean. Because the reader has already created this world in their head. They've imagined these two characters having a conversation somewhere. Maybe they were picturing them on a park bench or something. But because you, the author, haven't given them that information, they weren't to know that they were on a spaceship the whole time. So the sooner you let them know where they are, the better, right? And we've done that here. We've got number 4, Privet Drive. This is our location. And Rowling has deliberately, she could have said anything here. She could have said London, and that would have been correct. She could have said that they were in England. But she specified number 4, Privet Drive, and this extra detail, obviously it conjures this image of, a quaint kind of British terraced house, middle class. And it also lets us know that we're in the modern day, right? You wouldn't expect to see a Privet Drive in some high fantasy setting, or like in ancient history. Even in Arthurian times there wouldn't have been a Privet Drive. But if she'd said that they were in Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of London, that could have been any time in history, right? I think this is set in the 80s. This first chapter, because it's set 11 years before Harry wakes up and goes to and gets the mail through the door, right? And I think that was in the mid-90s, so this is in the 80s. It's not clear here, but you get that image, and so this is perfect. But yeah, perspective, I'm not entirely sure. We'll continue on. I really like this as well. Thank you very much. This is almost like dialogue, right? Thank you. Who's saying this? Mr. and Mrs. Dursley were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. Well, it's almost as if Mr. and Mrs. Dursley are saying thank you very much, but it's not. Rowling hasn't put it in dialogue, right? This is a part of the exposition. It's a part of the description, and that's just her voice coming out here, right? This is her writing style. It's very sing-songy, and yeah, it's great. It's a good first paragraph. It's a decent first paragraph. Let's move on to the next one. Here we go. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. So again we have more description of the Dursley family. Perspective is still not clear. We've got a description of Mr. Dursley and a description of Mrs. Dursley, and this is very much exposition. In we're being told about this family. We've got these words here. Let's have a look. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley were, right? These are our to be verbs. Were, they were. Mr. Dursley was. He was. Mrs. Dursley was. The very first sentence that isn't in this form, Mr. Dursley was, is this one, and that is the Dursleys had. These to be verbs and this, to have verb, these are passive, nothing's happening, right? No action is being taken. This is just pure description here. It's all telling. In show don't tell, or show versus tell, This is all telling. I don't like saying show, don't tell, because telling is fine. And we've got it here. This is all telling. But the situations with show, don't tell, it's sometimes it's nicer to show, right? But here the story hasn't actually begun yet. No action has been taken. Rowling is setting the scene. She's letting us know about this family, and that's cool. That's fine by me. We've got, what do we have here? I noticed when I was reading it that I put in some pauses that weren't necessarily indicated. We've got one here, right? Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time, right? Should we have a comma here? Not sure. Maybe. I think that a comma here, it would be allowed, and I naturally put that comma in myself when I was reading it. And you know, there are rules. There are all sorts of rules about punctuation, and maybe it's helpful to learn all of them. But personally, the way that I use punctuation is I will read a sentence out loud, and your natural breaks in the way that you read things will kind of indicate where the punctuation should go. That's the whole point of punctuation, right? But here we've taken the punctuation out, or Rowling has decided I'm not going to have a comma here. And she's doing it on purpose. And the reason is that she wants us to read through, or read all the way through the sentence without any kind of bumps in the way. I often think of commas as like kind of bumps in the road along the sentence, and she's taken that road bump out. So we read through, and I think with that comma, the sentence just becomes a little bit. There's too many clauses, right? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 clauses. Without it, I think the whole sentence itself is just a little bit nicer to read. Another form that I really like here is thin and blonde and, right? If you were to do this properly, this is what we learned in school, isn't it? It was thin, blonde, and had with the Oxford comma here. When you have a list of adjectives, you go adjective 1, comma, adjective 2, comma, and then your final one. But Rowling has gone with the unconventional and with no commas, and I really love it. It reads so nicely, especially with these single syllable adjectives. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly, right, you've got it's very sing-songy, and it works really, really well. I love this kind of thing. I saw another one down here as well. Had a small son called Dudley. Yeah, we could have a comma here. That would be fine, right? The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. She's taken it out. You probably shouldn't be putting in commas where they shouldn't go, but taking them out is a tool that that you can use to control the flow of your sentence and make it read a bit nicer. I also noticed, look, we've got some contractions here. I think in school they tell you not to use contractions, don't use them in essays. I don't know, maybe you're not meant to use contractions in legal documents, but they're absolutely fine in prose and in writing your stories. It's just another tool in your arsenal of controlling the flow of the sentence. Like if we were to replace it with you would, just did not. I mean, if you read that now, they were the last people you would expect to be involved because they just did not hold with such. It's a little bit too choppy, a little bit too robotic. So with those contractions, it makes it flow much nicer. And then you can also do the opposite, right? You don't have to always use the contraction. You can use the expanded version as well if that flows better. I think we'll leave it there. Yeah, let's move on to the next sentence. Again, still not entirely sure about the perspective, but I'm sure it'll come out. Here we go. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. So you'll notice I stumbled a little bit when I was reading, and that's a great indication that it might not read entirely smoothly for the reader either. Reading your work out loud is really important. I think Microsoft Word has like a text-to-speech thing in the review tab. I'll use that quite a lot, but nothing beats reading your own words out loud. Not just taking it slowly and reading it through in your head. Actually say the words out loud. I think what I stumbled over was Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, and I must admit, this Mr. Dursley and Mrs. Dursley, even though the words Mr. and Mrs. are different enough, when you're reading them, they're only one letter apart, right? Which can, if you're reading quickly, you might get confused between your Misters and your Mrs.s. Imagine if you had a character called. Imagine if you had a scene where one character was called Bob Cooper, and then we introduce a second character, Bobs Cooper. You might just get confused between Bob and Bobs. And it's the same here, right? We've only got that S is separating these two entirely different characters. So it's a little bit tricky here. We might ask ourselves, why hasn't she specifically named these people? Why hasn't she let us know that this is Vernon and this is Petunia? Good question. And I think the answer here is because we're also introducing the Potters. So we've got, how many characters have we introduced so far? We've got Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. We've got their son Dudley, who is named. We've got the Potters, Mr. and Mrs. Potter, and then we've also got the Potter's son. The only character who's been properly named so far is Dudley. That's the first name that we have. We've got and in general we've got the Dursleys and the Potters, and I think it's deliberate, right? She could have chosen to say Vernon Dursley and Petunia Dursley, and then down here come in with Lily Potter and James Potter. But at that point, you've got 6 names, and then immediately name Harry Potter down here. 6 names in 3 paragraphs is just too many, right? Your reader's not going to be able to keep track of that many names. They're going to forget them. But just introducing us to the Dursleys and the Potters, okay, I can get that, right? I can remember that. I've got the Dursleys, I've got the Potters, and we've also got Dudley here as well. That's fine. The reader can keep all of that in their head. So the trade-off here is that we do get a little bit of confusion between the Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, and then I had a bit of a stumble down here with Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister. I also noticed that we've got a bit of a problem here, and maybe that's caused by the fact that we haven't used those proper nouns of their names. But look at this sentence here. Because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband. I would call this a problem with pronoun attribution, because we've got this pronoun here, her, is referring to Mrs. Dursley, right? Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister, this her is referring to Mrs. Dursley, Mrs. Dursley's sister, and her good-for-nothing husband. This her does not refer to Mrs. Dursley. This refers to Mrs. Potter. So we've got these 2 hers in a row, and it's really not clear who this second her refers to. Now, we can figure it out immediately. As I was reading, you probably weren't confused about what I was saying. Her good-for-nothing husband, right? Imagine if this was, we were talking about Mrs. Dursley. Mrs. Dursley's sister and her good-for-nothing husband. Well, obviously, Mrs. Dursley wouldn't think of her own husband as good-for-nothing, right? So we figure it out in there as un-Dursley-ish as possible. Great. We've got a coined term here, un-Dursley-ish. It's very, very rolling. But yeah, the pronoun attribution is fine here. It resolves itself, but you can really easily run into a lot of problems with pronoun attribution. Let me try and come up with an example of somewhere where it might go really wrong, right? You could have something like, he ran to him and he fell over, right? So in this sentence, who fell over? Let's say like Dave. Dave ran to him and he fell over. Who fell over? Did Dave run over? Dave fall over? Or did Simon stood nearby? Simon stood nearby. Dave ran to him and he fell over. Who fell over? Was it Dave or was it Simon? Well, it's not entirely clear. And this is such a simple sentence as well. And we've got confusion. This kind of thing is really common. I find myself running into this problem all the time. It's fine in your first draft, right? If you're just hacking out some writing, go for it. But when you're in your second draft and you're editing, you want to watch out for this kind of stuff, because maybe you don't know who the reader they decided who fell over, right? It will become obvious who fell over in later sentences, where as you describe either Dave or Simon rolling around in the ground. But if you don't do that, then it's not entirely clear, and the reader's left with some confusion, and that's not good. We want to clear that up. I think that this is fine. Her sister and her good-for-nothing husband, I wouldn't be interested in fixing this one. It works fine. But when we get to this her, the reader isn't entirely sure. I would personally think that this her still refers to Mrs. Dursley, right? Her sister and her brother, you could say. If you think her sister and her boyfriend, they both refer to that first person, right? So yeah, that's fine though. I'm trying to think if there was anywhere else I stumbled. I don't think so. It was all pretty good. We've got some semicolons here. Good old semicolons. We got one here, and we got one down here. You can use semicolons. They're fine. They normally replace a full stop, right? So one of the rules of semicolons is you should always be able to replace one with a full stop, and it would still be grammatically correct, which it is here. They're just another tool in your arsenal. I don't know why I've said that twice now. Tool in your arsenal, is that even a phrase? A tool in your toolkit, a tool in your belt of controlling the flow of sentences. A lot of writers don't use semicolons. Semicolons are used for kind of merging two sentences together. It's like a soft full stop. And typically that second sentence will specifically relate to the first one. I use them. A lot of people don't use them. The only thing that you want to watch out for is using them too much, because the brain is really good at recognizing patterns. I mean, I even started recognizing just the word sister here. There's a lot of sister going on. Pretended she doesn't have a sister. Mrs. Potter's... Yeah, I mean, in this one sentence, we've got Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister. Sister, sister. We've got the word sister 3 times in a sentence. And it's the same with semicolons. You know, if you have 5 semicolons in your paragraph, people are going to start to notice them. And yeah, I think it's the brain is really good at recognizing patterns. And when you recognize a pattern, it's going to break the reader's immersion. I seem to remember, what was it? I think it was Harry Potter, and it was either Order of the Phoenix or Half-Blood Prince. So I would have been quite young, after the midnight release at the bookshop, getting home and reading one of them. And I remember encountering the word surreptitiously, which I'd never read in any of the previous Harry Potter books. So I think halfway through the series, J.K. Rowling decided to start using the word surreptitiously. And I had no idea what that word meant, right? So as I was kind of wolfing through this book, I came across the word surreptitiously, didn't know what it meant, and it immediately broke my immersion, right? When you're reading or when you're writing, you want people to enter that kind of Zen mode, right? Where they're just they're lost in the pages. And the word surreptitiously just yanked me straight out. I've got no idea what this word is. And that would have been fine, but then it appeared like 3 more times in that book. And every time it appeared, I was like, whoa, what's this? It's surreptitious again, and I still haven't got no idea what it means. It means like sneaky, right? But I didn't know that at the time. And that's like 3 uses of a word in a giant like 250,000 word book. And that was enough for me to recognize a pattern, and for it to pull me out of the page and to break my immersion. So, I mean, what can we learn from that? Well, there are words and there are bits of punctuation that have different levels of visibility. They stand out in different levels. Words like a, you can pretty much have as many a's as you want in a sentence, and people aren't going to think, oh, this sentence has got too many a's in it. No one's going to notice that. If you use the word surreptitious 5 times in a sentence, it's going to be like, what's going on, right? So you have these very invisible words and you have these incredibly visible words, and it's the same with punctuation. Semicolons are very visible. After a while, you might get used to them, and I'm used to them now. If I'm reading and I see a semicolon, it doesn't break my immersion at all. But if I kept seeing semicolons, it certainly would break my immersion. And then you have words like neighbours, right? If you use the word neighbours 5 times in this paragraph, that might be a bit too much. It was a bit like the word sister, right? We had 3 sisters in a single sentence. If you use 3 uses of the word sister throughout the entire book, it's not going to have that same effect as using surreptitiously 3 times in a book. No one's going to notice if you use sister even 20 times in a book. So sister's like barely invisible, but it's not as invisible as an A. And so there's this, you have to, you come up with this kind of index in your head as a writer of these invisible words and these words that you think are going to really stick out. You can use those surreptitious words. You can use them. You can use obsequious, but you use them sparingly. You really don't want to jar the reader. If you use surreptitious or obsequious 10 times on a page, they're going to think, what's going on? Their brain is immediately going to recognize these words. They're going to jump out at them, and you're going to break that immersion. Yeah, let's keep going. Have we figured out the perspective yet? Well, the next paragraph lets us know. But again, this has all been exposition so far. We've got 3 paragraphs of exposition. It's just describing these 2 families and their relationship with each other. But nothing has happened yet. Still nothing has happened. And we can see that this next paragraph is actually when the story starts, because we begin with a when. This is places our time, our location in time. So this is where we actually kick off, and here we go. We've got our first active verb. Something is happening now. When they woke up on the dull grey Tuesday, our story starts. And look, this is very clear. This is very obvious. Our story. This is J.K. Rowling referring to her and you. She's referring to herself, me, our. It's my story and it's your story. And this lets us know that we're in the narrative perspective, right? We're in narrative omniscient. Let's read this. Let's read this paragraph, and then we'll come back to that thought about the narrative omniscient perspective. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull grey Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. So we have some more indications that we're in the narrative omniscient perspective here. The first indications were straight away. We're talking about two characters. We're talking about them externally. We're not really experiencing the world through Mr. and Mrs. Dursley's eyes. We're being told about them. And it's J.K. Rowling who's telling us about them. She's the narrator. You could almost imagine up here we begin with something like, hi, my name's J.K. Rowling, and I'm about to tell you a story about a boy who became a wizard. So here's, let's begin the story, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, right? It's her voice as a narrator is very, very strong here. And there are some other indications that we're in this narrative perspective as well. One of them, where are we? Yeah, look at this. None of them noticed. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. Okay, so who did notice it, right? If none of our characters in the scene noticed it, then who did? How do we know about this large tawny owl? And the answer is that J.K. Rowling noticed it because she's God of this story, right? She knows everything. She knows every detail. She knows all the thoughts in all the characters' heads. She knows everything that's going to happen in the future. Everything that's happened in the past. That's how the omniscient perspective works. You have full control. Omniscient perspective is fine. You often hear people warning against it. Don't write in omniscient. Narrative omniscient is slightly different, but it's a fine perspective to write in. I think Dune is written in omniscient. Silmarillion, right? When you have one paragraph that's describing the passage of time over eons, right? You can only really do that if you have that God's perspective. It's fine, and the only thing that you need to watch out for with omniscient is that you're not accidentally going into the omniscient perspective, right? If you've chosen to write your story in close third person, specifically through the eyes of a single character, then you don't want to be accidentally writing something in omniscient. So let's say, for example, let's say that we're in close third person and we're in Harry's perspective. We don't want to say something like Harry didn't notice Snape outside his door, right? From that narrative perspective, you could do something like that. You could say Harry didn't notice all sorts of things. You could say that little did Harry know that in a few years' time Dumbledore would be dead. And you could put that in the first book if you were to stick with this narrative perspective. But what we will find is that Rowling begins the book in this narrative perspective where she knows everything and she's describing the story. And then she will quickly switch into close third person when we start the next chapter with Harry. And I had a little read through and I noticed that I think the chapter 2 begins with it begins still a little bit omniscient narrator, but then it quickly goes into Harry's perspective the minute Harry wakes up, and every time after that we don't say Mr. Dursley anymore, we say Uncle Vernon, because from Harry's perspective he's not Mr. Dursley, he's Uncle Vernon, and that's when we get the name Vernon. So Rowling isn't going to stay in this I'm telling you a story children mode for very long. She's going to switch, and this is really, really common in children's books, right? This narrator voice. Roald Dahl does it a lot. a lot of his books, you can tell is almost like he's a character in the book, and he's telling you this story. I think the Narnia books have a very strong. I seem to remember reading the word "I" in some of those books, almost as if it's a first person, as if C.S. Lewis is like he's a character and he's telling you about all of these crazy stories. Lemony Snicket, obviously, that's a classic, more recent example. And I think the reason why it's so popular in children's books is that it makes it really good for reading to kids, right? If you're a teacher or parents or babysitter reading out loud, if you have that really strong narrator voice, especially one as sing-songy as Rowling's, then it makes it really fun, and it makes it more easy for the kids to connect with the reader. There was another, where was it? Something I noticed. Yeah, look at this. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work. Who is making this assessment that the tie is boring? It's obviously not Mr. Dursley, right? He probably thinks that the tie he picked out was pretty good, right? The person who's telling us that it's most boring is J.K. Rowling, right? This is her narrator voice. But as I say, we don't stay in it for long. We then switch to Harry, and close third person is far more common. Most fantasy books you read will be written in close third person, and that's just because it's really nice to just be inside someone's head. Close third person and first person are pretty much exactly the same perspective. It's just that first person uses I and close third person uses he, she. I ended on this paragraph here because this is our hook, right? This lets us know that the story has started. When the reader reads this, what Rowling is hoping that you've made it this far down the page, then we get to here, and this is when the craziness starts happening, right? We have a large tawny owl flutter past the window, and notice that this is just a single paragraph. We've got a single sentence paragraph. It's like a medium length sentence. It's not like a one-word paragraph. But these single sentence paragraphs have so much power behind them, right? And so you have to save them. Don't use them too much. But when you do use them, make sure that you're going to use it for a really great sentence like this. The tawny owl fluttering past the window. Okay, now she's got me. Now I'm interested. I want to read more. I also noticed, where was it? There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would be happening all over the country. Strange and mysterious, right? They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious. That's really cool. It ties the page together, right? We've got this callback. Maybe people won't notice this kind of thing. She, as a writer, was very, very deliberate about it, right? And she was having fun here, even if she was like, oh well, maybe my readers won't notice that I've done this, but I've noticed, and she, she's having fun with the writing here, and even maybe subconsciously it's doing something. You're bringing these words strange and mysterious back up again. You're introducing that mystery and that hook. Yeah, so I really like that. No other issues. This is, this is the beginning of the story, and yeah, it works really well, right? That's what a first page should do. Is it should make you want to read more. I've gotten to this point in the story, and I definitely want to read more. But I think we'll call it there for now. Yeah, let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions of any kind of word level analysis that you want to see of any other books, maybe the next book in the series, or maybe another writer, or maybe we could even continue with this chapter and see what we can find. But yeah, let me know, and if you want to read anything that I've written, I'll put a link in the description down below. Cool. All right, nice one. I'll catch you next time. Bye.